In 465 BCE, a woman was violently dragged into the courtyard of what was considered the most magnificent palace on earth. What followed was so savage that even seasoned soldiers later struggled to speak of it without shaking. Her crime was simple but unforgivable. She refused the wrong man. What makes this moment truly terrifying is not its brutality, but its normality. This was not an exception. It was routine. Just another day in the Persian royal court. One act in a decades-long pattern that transformed the world's most beautiful palace into a place of silent psychological torment. And the man responsible is one you already know. His name appears in history books and blockbuster films. You've seen his armies march across screens, but you've never been shown who he really was. History prefers to remember King Xerxes I of Persia as a great warrior, the ruler who led massive forces against Greece, the architect behind monuments of unimaginable scale. That version of him is easier to accept. It's cleaner. But behind the gold-covered walls of his palaces, a different kind of war was taking place. This conflict had no weapons, no battlefields, and no chance of escape. Its victims could not flee, could not fight back, and could not even speak the truth without risking everything they loved. What if the worst crimes of Xerxes' reign had nothing to do with Greece at all? What if they were happening daily, inside his own household, to the people who should have been safest near him? Stay with this story, because what you're about to learn challenges everything commonly believed about ancient Persia. By the end, you'll understand why these events were quietly buried for more than 2,000 years. To begin, we must ask a question historians almost never raise. What happens to a human being when everyone around them insists they are not human? In October 486 BCE, inside the throne room of Persepolis, a 36-year-old man named Xerxes inherited control of the largest empire the world had ever seen. His father, Darius the Great, was dead. From that moment onward, Xerxes would never again experience a genuine human interaction. Every person who approached him was required to perform a ritual known as proskynesis. They did not simply bow or kneel. They lay face down on the ground, kissing the earth before him as if worshipping a god. Turning one's back on the king was forbidden and punishable by death. Eye contact was restricted. Speech was impossible unless permission was granted. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded chilling details about this system. Messengers carrying urgent news were forced to wait outside the throne room for days, or even weeks before being allowed inside. Even if cities were burning or rebellions were spreading, the king could not be disturbed at the wrong moment. Interrupting the god-king carried the risk of immediate execution. This rigid protocol did not merely protect Xerxes. It isolated him completely. Xerxes was not born believing he was divine. He was taught to believe it. His mother, Atossa, understood power better than nearly anyone alive. As the daughter of Cyrus the Great, she had witnessed the empire's founding and its darkest internal battles. She had seen brothers murder brothers, heirs eliminated overnight, and entire family lines erased in succession struggles. She knew one brutal truth. In the Persian court, family was not a source of safety. It was the greatest danger of all. Atossa trained her son accordingly. Trust no one. Control everything. Never show weakness. Because the moment a ruler appeared human, vulnerable, or compassionate, he was already dead. Greek sources describe Atossa as having more influence over Xerxes than any advisor or general. What she shaped was not simply a king, but something far more dangerous. A man who genuinely believed other human beings existed only to serve his will. Nowhere was this mindset more destructive than within the royal household itself. Popular culture presents Persian kings as indulgent figures surrounded by endless pleasure and countless wives. The reality was far more controlled and unsettling. The royal household, known as the Anderun, functioned as a powerful political institution. And contrary to common belief, Xerxes appears to have had only one official wife throughout his adult life, Queen Amestris. This fact changes everything. These women were not disposable figures hidden away and forgotten. The queen was a permanent and influential presence. Amestris controlled vast estates, commanded her own guards, held diplomatic meetings, and oversaw major construction projects across the empire. She was one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. But all of that power rested on a single condition: Xerxes' approval. With one command, it could be stripped away instantly. The royal household was filled with women who held extraordinary authority, yet lived under absolute psychological dependence. Their wealth, safety, and survival existed entirely at the king's discretion. Inside a palace built to showcase beauty and perfection, fear ruled quietly, relentlessly, every single day. The king's mother, his wife, his sisters, his daughters, and the wives and daughters of his closest relatives all lived within the royal household. On the surface, their lives appeared impossibly luxurious. They wore robes worth more than entire cities. They ate foods shipped from the farthest edges of the known world. Hundreds of servants existed for the sole purpose of fulfilling their needs. Yet despite this overwhelming wealth, they were prisoners. The Greek physician Xerxes, who served at the Persian court decades after Xerxes' death, described the royal household in ways that sound less like a palace and more like a carefully designed nightmare. The women's quarters were completely sealed from the outside world, surrounded by high walls and locked gates. No adult male was permitted inside except the king himself and a small number of eunuchs who had been castrated specifically to serve in the Anderun. These women could look out through high windows and see the city below. They could hear life happening beyond the walls. But they could not leave. They could not participate. They possessed everything except the one thing that mattered most: control over their own lives. What makes this situation even more disturbing is that it was not viewed as cruelty. It was framed as honor, as protection, as the highest privilege a woman could receive. From birth, these women were trained to see confinement as safety, obedience as power, and isolation as intimacy with the divine ruler himself. This is how systemic control works at its most effective level. The victims absorb it. They defend it. They lose the ability to imagine another way of living. For decades, the system functioned exactly as intended. Official Persian inscriptions carved into stone across the empire speak only of harmony, prosperity, and divine order. Everything was stable. Everything was controlled. And then something broke. This is where Herodotus enters the story. Writing roughly 30 years after Xerxes' death, he recorded an incident so unsettling that scholars have debated it for more than 2,000 years. To be clear, Herodotus was Greek, writing for a Greek audience that despised Persia. His account could be exaggerated. It could be propaganda. It could even be entirely fabricated. But the psychological detail he provides is so precise that it cannot be dismissed outright. According to Herodotus, sometime in the late 470s BCE, after the disastrous Greek campaign, after Xerxes returned to Persia in humiliation, the king developed an obsession with the wife of his own brother, Mezistes. History does not preserve her name. She is remembered only through what was done to her. She was married to one of the empire's most powerful military commanders, a man who governed provinces and led armies. She was a mother. Within the strict limits of court life, she lived what could be described as a stable existence. And Xerxes wanted her. What makes this moment revealing is that Xerxes did not simply take her. Despite his absolute power and lifelong conditioning, some part of him still sought consent. He wanted to be desired, not merely obeyed. He approached her. He made advances. He offered promises. And she refused. Consider what that refusal meant. This was the most powerful man in the world, a ruler who had ordered executions for far smaller offenses. And she said no. For most rulers, even tyrants, that might have ended the matter, perhaps with punishment or exile. But Xerxes was not most rulers. He believed his desires were expressions of cosmic order. Resistance was not personal defiance. It was disorder itself, something that had to be corrected. So he redirected his desire toward her daughter. Artaint was likely in her late teens or early 20s. She was Xerxes' own niece. Unlike her mother, she either could not or did not refuse. The affair began. And this is where the story becomes even darker. Xerxes now had absolute control over the daughter, and some part of him needed to demonstrate that power in a way that would punish the woman who had rejected him. According to Herodotus, Xerxes promised Artaint anything she wished. Anything in the empire. Name it, and it would be hers. Whether manipulated into it or genuinely desiring it, she asked for a single object, a magnificent robe personally woven by Queen Amestris herself. The garment was unique, threaded with gold and royal Persian purple, a visible symbol of the queen's authority and status. There was nothing else like it in the world. Xerxes gave it to her. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. Xerxes was not foolish. He understood the symbolism perfectly. Giving his mistress his wife's personal robe was a calculated insult. It was a deliberate act of humiliation. He knew it would provoke the queen. On some level, that was the point. The robe was not a gift. It was a weapon. By transferring that garment, Xerxes was asserting absolute dominance over every woman in his household. He was declaring that their power, their dignity, even their identity existed only at his pleasure. And the consequences of that decision would soon reveal just how much violence was required to maintain the illusion of divine control. This is what absolute power does to empathy. It doesn't simply weaken it. It reverses it. The suffering of others becomes spectacle. Conflict turns into entertainment. Pain becomes proof of dominance. When Queen Amestris saw her robe draped over our taint, she understood immediately what it meant. She also understood exactly how to respond. She planned her revenge with the calm precision of someone who had survived her entire life inside the merciless machinery of the Persian court. But what elevates this story beyond ordinary palace intrigue is the target she chose. Amestris did not strike at Artaint. She aimed her wrath at Artaint's mother, the woman who had dared to refuse the king. The woman who, in every meaningful sense, was completely innocent. According to Herodotus, Amestris waited patiently for the perfect moment, the king's birthday celebration. This was no ordinary feast. By Persian custom, the king was required to grant any request made of him on that day. It was a sacred obligation, performed publicly before the most powerful nobles of the empire. Refusing was unthinkable. In front of the entire court, Amestris made her request. She asked that the wife of Mezistes be given to her as a gift. Xerxes understood instantly what this meant. For the first time in the story, he hesitated. He begged Amestris to choose something else, anything else. He offered her wealth, cities, even armies. But the same ritual laws that elevated him above all others now trapped him. The request had been made publicly. It could not be denied. The woman was delivered into the queen's custody. What followed was so horrific that even Herodotus struggles to describe it. Amestris ordered the woman mutilated in ways designed not merely to punish, but to erase her identity entirely. Her breasts were cut off. Her nose, ears, lips, and tongue were removed. She was then sent back to her husband in this condition, alive, as a message. There is no way to soften this. It stands among the most horrifying acts of cruelty recorded in the ancient world. The level of deliberate sadism is almost impossible to comprehend. But to understand it, we must look beyond the violence itself and examine the message behind it. Amestris was not simply taking revenge on a perceived rival. She was asserting authority within the royal household. The message was unmistakable. I am the queen. My power here is absolute. Anyone who becomes the object of the king's desire, even unwillingly, will be destroyed so thoroughly that their suffering becomes a warning to all who follow. Yet there is an even darker layer to this act. By targeting the mother rather than the daughter, Amestris punished virtue itself. The woman was punished not for betrayal, but for refusal, for loyalty, for moral resistance. The message was chillingly clear. Dignity has no value here. Refusal is not strength. Resistance is not noble. In this world, survival belongs only to those who submit. Mezistes, the woman's husband, reacted exactly as one would expect. Consumed by rage and grief, he attempted to rebel against his own brother. The revolt failed. Xerxes responded with absolute force. Mezistes, his sons, his daughters, his entire bloodline, were hunted down and executed. Nothing was spared. The woman who said no, the daughter who could not say no, and an entire family were erased. All of it stemmed from one belief, that the king's desires were divine commands. This brings us to the question historians tend to avoid. Was this a single aberration, an isolated horror in an otherwise stable reign? Or was it a glimpse into something far more systemic? The problem is the nature of our sources. Persian royal records were propaganda by design. They recorded victories, construction projects, and religious devotion. They did not record scandals. They did not document family violence. They certainly did not preserve anything that questioned the king's divinity or humanity. What remains are fragments, Greek accounts that may be biased, archaeological hints that cannot speak, and the internal logic of absolute power itself. But there are things we know with certainty. We know Xerxes was raised in a system deliberately designed to eliminate empathy. We know he was conditioned from childhood to see other people as extensions of his will. We know he suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in ancient military history in Greece, returning home with his authority publicly challenged and his ego deeply wounded. And we know that after Greece, something changed. The historical record shows that Xerxes largely withdrew from public life. He stopped leading campaigns. He stopped traveling across the empire. Instead, he retreated into his palaces, especially Persepolis. His later years were dominated by construction projects and what sources vaguely describe as private activities. What were those activities? The records don't say. But they do show an increasingly isolated court. They show Xerxes' sons growing up under a shadow of fear and suspicion. They show the rising influence of court officials like Artabanus, commander of the royal bodyguard, whose power expanded dramatically during this period. All of this suggests something deeply ironic. The system Xerxes inherited and enforced ultimately consumed him as well. Absolute power did not free him. It imprisoned him. He became trapped within the very machinery he controlled, isolated from truth, surrounded by fear, and incapable of genuine human connection. In the end, Xerxes was not just a tyrant ruling over prisoners. He was one himself. He could trust no one. Genuine relationships were impossible. He couldn't even be certain that his own sons wouldn't murder him. A fear that, as events would prove, was entirely justified. For the women of the royal household, this period must have been a living nightmare. A paranoid, isolated god-king with absolute authority over their bodies, their lives, and their families. There were no appeals, no protections, no escape. And this wasn't unique to Xerxes. This was the system. This was how the Achaemenid dynasty functioned for more than 2 centuries. Xerxes did not invent this machinery of control. He inherited it, refined it, and passed it on. In August 465 BCE, inside the palace at Persepolis, just after midnight, King Xerxes I, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, was murdered in his own bed. The details are uncertain because ancient sources contradict one another. But the most compelling version, recorded by multiple Greek historians, tells a chilling story. Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, the man whose sole responsibility was to protect the king, was the architect of the conspiracy. Along with a small group of collaborators, he entered the king's private chambers and killed Xerxes while he slept. But the assassination was only the first step. Artabanus then executed a plan so psychologically calculated that it reveals just how deeply dysfunction had infected the royal family. He went to Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes, and told him that his older brother, Crown Prince Darius, had murdered their father. He presented fabricated evidence and exploited the young prince's shock, grief, and rage. Believing the lie, Artaxerxes executed his own brother in revenge. Only later, when Artabanus attempted to seize power for himself, did the truth emerge. Realizing he had been manipulated into committing fratricide, Artaxerxes ordered Artabanus and all his co-conspirators hunted down and killed. Consider what this reveals. The king was murdered by his own bodyguard. One son murdered another. And it all occurred inside the most heavily guarded palace in the ancient world, surrounded by thousands of elite troops. How does something like this happen unless the entire system is rotten to its core? Unless fear and paranoia have spread so completely that assassination becomes the only perceived path to survival? Xerxes spent his life building walls, around his palace, around his household, around his own humanity. In the end, those walls did not protect him. They imprisoned him. For the women of the royal household, Xerxes' death changed nothing. Artaxerxes I inherited the throne, and with it the system. The Anderun remained. Royal women continued to be treated as political assets. Isolation, surveillance, and control persisted. Human beings were still reduced to instruments of dynastic power. In many ways, the system became even more rigid. Artaxerxes later arranged for his own son, the future Darius II, to marry his half-sister Persipolis, a union designed explicitly to consolidate power within the royal bloodline. Sibling marriage, influenced by evolving Zoroastrian interpretations but driven primarily by political calculation, became increasingly common in later Achaemenid generations. This pattern continued for another century and a half, until Alexander the Great finally burned Persepolis to the ground. Through all those years, the system endured. Generations of women were born, lived, and died behind palace walls, never experiencing life beyond them. They knew no other reality. And here is the most chilling part. This was not viewed as cruelty. It was seen as civilization, as order, as the natural structure of the world. The kings who enforced it believed they were fulfilling divine duty. The priests who sanctified it believed they were serving the gods. And many of the women who suffered within it defended it, because they had been taught from birth that this was honor, not horror. This is what systemic oppression looks like at its most effective. When the victims cannot recognize their own captivity. When the cage is so ornate, so beautiful, that it no longer feels like a cage at all. The ruins of Persepolis still stand today in the Iranian desert, their towering columns stretching skyward like broken fingers. Tourists walk among them, imagining lost glory and imperial grandeur. But those stones remember something else. They remember the women whose names were never recorded, the voices that were never heard, the lives lived entirely at someone else's pleasure. The story of Xerxes' household is not just ancient history. It is a warning that echoes across centuries and civilizations. It shows what happens when we construct systems that place any human being beyond accountability, when power is mistaken for divinity, when societies convince themselves that some people are born to rule and others are born to serve. The palace is rubble now. The empire is dust. But the lesson remains. Absolute power does not only corrupt the one who holds it. It corrupts everyone who participates in sustaining it. It turns love into control, duty into fear, and people into tools. And that is not a story confined to the ancient world. It is happening right now, somewhere beyond walls we cannot see.